They tried to erase the past, but the past rode back. Over 200 cowboys filled the streets of Silverton after Lauren McKay stood up for one man, one horse, and one act of kindness that changed everything. Lauren McKay never planned to become a symbol of anything. In her early 40s, she was just trying to keep her late father's pharmacy alive in Silverton, Colorado, a small mountain town once known for its cattle ranches and wide open spaces. Nestled between rolling hills and fading wooden storefronts, McKay's Pharmacy was the last independent shop on Main Street, surrounded now by shiny new coffee chains and real estate offices promising a fresh start to newcomers. Silverton had changed fast. The once tight-knit, cowboy-rooted community was being replaced by condo developments and wine bars. Locals who had lived there for generations felt out of place, their stories pushed aside in favor of sleek branding and urban aesthetics. And yet, Lauren stayed. She stocked shelves herself, hand-delivered prescriptions to elderly customers, and kept a small bulletin board of black and white photos from the town's ranching days. To outsiders, she was just a small business owner fighting a losing battle. But to the old-timers, Lauren was something more, someone who hadn't forgotten what Silverton used to be, and someone quietly holding the line while the world around them shifted. It was a crisp Thursday morning when Lauren's quiet routine was interrupted. The bell above the pharmacy door jingled sharply as a man stepped in, dust-covered boots, sun-creased face, and a cowboy hat that had clearly seen better days. Jack Foster. Everyone in Silverton knew him. A fifth-generation rancher, Jack rarely came to town unless he had to. He nodded politely, holding a slip of paper. "It's my granddaughter," he said. "Asthma's kickin' in hard. Doc sent this over." Lauren didn't ask questions. She grabbed the prescription inhaler from behind the counter and handed it to him. Minutes later, a loud commotion erupted just outside. Lauren stepped out to find a town enforcement officer standing in front of Jack, clipboard in hand, scolding him for tying his horse near a loading zone. "You can't just park livestock on Main Street. This isn't the 1800s, the officer snapped. Jack stood his ground. "I don't see any signs saying no horses. It's an emergency." The officer raised his voice. "Then take your emergencies to the parking lot like everyone else." Lauren felt her chest tighten. The injustice was so casual, so bureaucratic, it made her stomach turn. "He's not blocking anything," she said firmly, stepping between the officer and Jack. "And last I checked, there's no law against a man bringing his horse into town to save his granddaughter's life." The officer sneered. "Ma'am, stay out of this." But Lauren didn't budge. In that moment, something shifted. Her words weren't loud, but they cut through the growing crowd that had started to gather. A few older locals nodded silently. Others pulled out phones. Jack's granddaughter, barely 9, peeked over from the truck window, still wheezing softly. Finally, the officer left, but not before issuing a citation and mumbling something about the last of the Wild West. Jack looked at Lauren, his voice quiet. "Thanks." She shrugged. "You were just doing what any grandfather would do." But that small act, one woman speaking up against a petty abuse of power, rippled through the town in ways no one expected. The next morning, Silverton would wake up to the sound of hooves. The next morning, just as the sun began to rise over the pine-covered hills of Silverton, the usual hum of delivery trucks and morning joggers was drowned out by something unexpected: hoofbeats. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Lauren looked out from the pharmacy window and froze. Main Street was filled, absolutely packed, with riders, ranchers, cowhands, and families from the outskirts of town, all on horseback. Some wore worn-out denim and dusty boots. Others brought their kids along, sitting on saddles next to them. A few carried flags stitched with the Silverton cattle brand, symbols of their long-forgotten heritage. They didn't yell. They didn't chant. They simply rode in, one by one, and lined up in silence from end to end of the street, blocking the modern storefronts with the same pride their ancestors once carried into town. Lauren stepped outside, heart pounding. A familiar voice called to her, "Jack Foster, now atop a sturdy bay mare. We figured if the town wants to erase us, maybe it needs a reminder that we're still here. She blinked, overwhelmed. Jack, this is just folks saying, thanks, and standing up for what matters. Local business owners peeked out from behind their windows, unsure of what to make of the scene. Some scoffed. But others, especially those whose families had been part of Silverton for generations, felt something stir in their chests. News spread fast. By noon, local reporters were on the scene. Drone cameras hovered overhead. A hashtag was already trending, #RideForSilverton. The mayor, caught off guard, issued a hasty statement urging calm and compliance with city codes, but it only fueled the fire. Interviews poured in. Riders shared their stories, how their great-grandparents built this town, how their traditions were being paved over by developers with no roots. The horse parade stayed all day. They didn't break anything. They didn't argue. They just existed, visible, present, impossible to ignore. That night, Lauren sat on the pharmacy steps, watching the last of the riders head out under the pink-orange sky. A young girl handed her a note folded in half. "Thank you for remembering us." Lauren held it tightly. Something had changed. Not just in the town, but in herself. By the next morning, Silverton was no longer just a quiet mountain town, it was a national headline. News outlets picked up the story, Cowboy's ride to defend small-town heritage. Social media lit up with support. Photos of horses lined along Main Street, riders in wide-brimmed hats tipping them toward the camera, and Lauren McKay standing firm in front of her pharmacy, were being shared across the country. For many, it felt like a scene from another time, one they didn't realize they missed. But within Silverton, something more subtle was happening. People started talking. At the diner, once filled with newcomers sipping overpriced lattes, regulars now leaned over coffee mugs, asking questions they hadn't asked in years. What happened to the Jackson Ranch? Remember when the fall fair used to have horse pulls? Memories once buried under the pressure of modernization began bubbling to the surface. The town council, initially dismissive, now faced growing public pressure. Residents began showing up at meetings, not just to complain, but to listen, to elders, ranchers, and those who remembered the soul of Silverton before the condos came. One council member, Marissa Bell, a transplant from the city, stood up during a particularly heated discussion. "I moved here because this place felt real," she said. "But if we bulldoze every part of its past, we're just making another version of where I came from." Her words were met with nods. Even David Whitmore, the urban planner behind much of Silverton's transformation, began to hesitate. He'd long believed progress meant sleek lines, clean branding, and efficient use of space. But seeing the pride in those riders' eyes, he couldn't shake it. They weren't relics. They were residents. And Lauren? She kept doing what she always did. Filling prescriptions, delivering to elderly folks who couldn't make it in, and hanging up more old photos on the pharmacy wall, each one a silent protest, a reminder of where they came from. What had started as a single act of defiance had cracked something open. The town was beginning to look at itself not through the lens of what it could become, but through the truth of what it already was, a place with roots, stories, and people worth remembering. The spark that Lauren had unintentionally lit turned into something much bigger than anyone expected. Within days of the ride and protest, a group of concerned residents, ranchers, teachers, business owners, and even a few students, formed a grassroots committee called Silverton Roots. Their mission, to preserve the town's western and agricultural history, not as a museum piece, but as a living, breathing part of everyday life. They weren't alone. A retired history professor from the University of Colorado, Dr. Helen Carter, who had grown up just outside Silverton, returned to town after seeing the news. She offered to help document the oral histories of local families, starting with the oldest ranchers. "We can't preserve what we don't record," she told the town council. Meanwhile, Mark D'Angelo, a civil rights attorney who had been visiting his in-laws in town during the protest, offered his legal expertise pro bono. Your heritage is part of your identity, he told the committee. And under state law, you may have grounds to protect parts of it. With public support growing, the town council was forced to act. A proposal was drafted to designate part of downtown Silverton as a Western Heritage District, a zone where zoning laws and new construction would have to align with the town's historic character. At first, some developers pushed back. But the tide was turning. Petitions gathered thousands of signatures. A special town hall meeting drew a record crowd. What surprised everyone most wasn't the loud voices, but the quiet ones, older residents who had never spoken up before now stepping up to share their stories, photos, and dreams for a town that didn't erase its past but honored it. Lauren watched from the sidelines, both proud and humbled. She never asked to lead anything. She just stood up for what felt right. And now, people who had never spoken to one another were working side by side, painting old barns, restoring signs, replanting native wildflowers along the trails. Silverton was remembering who it was. Not stuck in time, but grounded in it. The energy had shifted. It wasn't about resisting change, it was about choosing how to change, and what parts of the soul were too sacred to lose. For most of her life, Lauren McKay never saw herself as someone who made waves. She believed in consistency, in doing what was right even when no one noticed. But now, she couldn't walk through town without someone stopping her, shaking her hand, offering a warm smile, or thanking her for standing up when it counted. What surprised her more, though, was how others around her began to change too. David Whitmore, the town planner once known for steamrolling tradition in the name of progress, began attending every Silverton Roots meeting. He listened more than he spoke. He even offered to revise his development blueprints to include traditional building materials and Western-style facades that match the town's character. One afternoon, he stopped by Lauren's pharmacy, no clipboard, no agenda. Just a quiet look in his eyes. "I used to think the past was something we had to outgrow," he admitted. "Now I realize it's something we stand on." Lauren smiled, handing him a cup of tea. "You're not the only one." Even the younger generation began to feel a sense of pride that hadn't been there before. High school students volunteered to help digitize old town records. A group of teenagers organized a fundraiser to restore the wooden Silverton sign that had been taken down years ago. People were finally seeing their community not as a temporary stop, but as a home with roots that mattered. As for Lauren, something inside her shifted too. She began to see her pharmacy not just as a business, but as a gathering place, where people came for medicine, yes, but also for stories, memories, and a reminder that kindness still had a place in the modern world. One evening, just before closing, Jack Foster walked in carrying a weathered leather bag. "It was your grandfather's," he said softly. "He once stitched up my brother's arm out in the field. I think it belongs with you now." Lauren held the bag in her hands, smooth, worn, and heavy with meaning. She felt a quiet weight settle in her chest. Not pressure. Purpose. She didn't ask for this legacy, but now that it had found her, she intended to carry it well. Spring came to Silverton with a kind of energy the town hadn't felt in years. On the first Saturday of each month, the streets filled, not with traffic or tourists, but with laughter, music, and hoofbeats. The Silverton Heritage Market was born, and with it came a revival of everything the town once thought it had lost. Ranchers rode into town proudly. Artisans set up booths selling handmade leather goods, preserves, and wooden crafts. Local bands played folk tunes while children learned to rope hay bales in the square. Lauren stood under a striped awning outside her pharmacy, now freshly painted and trimmed with rustic cedar. A handmade sign above the door read, "McKay's Apothecary, since 1912. Folks stopped by not just for medicine, but for old family remedies she'd begun sharing, passed down through generations. The leather bag Jack had given her sat behind the counter, polished and honored. Customers often asked about it, and she'd smile, telling them the story, how it came from a time when a doctor rode through storms to help a neighbor, and how those values hadn't gone anywhere. David Whitmore, now a frequent visitor to the market, stood beside a plaque he'd helped fund, marking the newly designated Western Heritage District. He no longer wore sharp suits. These days, it was flannel and jeans, his hair a little longer, his pace a little slower. "Funny how a town can remember itself," he said once, as he watched a group of kids ride miniature ponies down the sidewalk. Lauren nodded. Sometimes all it takes is one reason to stop forgetting. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the last of the riders disappeared down the dirt road, Lauren locked up the shop and looked out across Main Street. Lanterns flickered on porch posts. Music still lingered in the air. The town wasn't frozen in time, it was alive, moving forward with its roots firmly planted. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a thread, woven into something bigger, something enduring. Silverton had found its rhythm again, not in nostalgia, but in balance. A place where history breathed, not behind glass, but in the everyday lives of people who finally understood that progress doesn't have to erase the past. Looking back, no one could point to a single grand gesture that changed Silverton. It wasn't some sweeping speech or dramatic vote, it was a quiet moment. A woman standing up for a man and his horse. A granddaughter's wheezing breath. A community that remembered who they were when it mattered most. The truth is, legacies don't vanish overnight. They fade quietly, over time, until one day, it seems like they were never there. But just as quietly, they can return. All it takes is someone willing to say, "This still matters." Lauren McKay didn't plan to become the heart of that reminder. She didn't set out to challenge a system or inspire a town. She simply chose not to look away. And in doing so, she gave others permission to look closer, at their stories, their neighbors, their values. What Silverton learned is something many towns forget. Progress doesn't mean forgetting who you are. True growth happens when you find ways to carry your roots forward, not bury them. A cowboy on horseback can still belong next to a coffee shop. A pharmacy with a hand-painted sign can still hold its own beside modern storefronts. And one act of kindness, a stand made in a quiet voice, can ripple farther than you ever intended. Today, Silverton is a place where old and new walk side by side. Where tradition is not an obstacle, but a compass. Where every first Saturday, as the hoofbeats return and laughter spills into the streets, you're reminded that community isn't something we inherit, it's something we choose to protect. So if you ever find yourself in a town that feels like it's losing itself, remember Silverton. Remember Lauren McKay. And remember this. Sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't change the world overnight. But it might just remind the world of who it used to be, and who it still can be. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit like, share it with someone who believes in the power of heritage, and subscribe for more stories that remind us who we are. Because sometimes, remembering is the most powerful thing we can do.